Welcome to the Rights Trap podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over the last two series, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the area of human rights. In this series, we're focusing on the struggle to end modern slavery. I'm Todd. In today's episode, we're discussing perpetrators of slavery. My guest is Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, Assistant Professor at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, and Associate Professor in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham. He is author of What Slaveholders Think: How Contemporary Perpetrators Rationalize What They Do, which is published by Columbia University Press in 2017. So, welcome, Austin. It's great to have you here on this episode of The Rights Track.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me.
What I'm really interested in is that we rarely get to meet people who have either met, talked with, and let alone studied the perpetrators of slavery. So I guess my first question is, how did you come to want to work on this topic?
That's a great question. I wanted to work on this topic because, as you know, and I'm a fan of the podcast, there is so much great work being done around policy, around legislation, around larger publicity campaigns, and around victims and of survivors. And this is something that we know too little about, and more work needs to be done. But in that process, I feel like we know less than we should about perpetrators, who are an important part of what is essentially the broken relationship of slavery. I mean, these are people who are in relationship. It's a fundamental and early observation that our colleague Kevin Bales made quite some time ago. So if it's a relationship, then what role do perpetrators have, not just in slavery, but also in emancipation? Do we have a plan for them? Do we have any way of thinking about them in our funding and in our theories? And a quick sort of ride through the literature suggests the answer is no, we don't.
And by relationship, it's one that both, with lack of a better word, perpetrator and slave take part in. So we need to think about that as a power relationship, but also it has cultural underpinnings, it has social understandings and norms developed around it. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you, where did you go to find perpetrators? So, the world's a big place, you had to start somewhere. What made you decide to go where you went, and where did you go?
That's an important question, because it actually, the methodology has theoretical implications to get sort of too geeky too fast. But I was in India. And in India, this is a place where the sorts of rights violations that I was looking at, which we recognize as bonded labor, international law recognizes bonded labor, and we would talk about as a form of contemporary slavery. This is a set of relationships that don't often... individuals don't think of themselves as criminals. Perpetrators don't think of themselves as criminals. In many cases, they're not hiding from the law. In some cases, they have close family or sort of networked relationships with the law. So what fascinated me was that these are folks who are violating human rights but not local norms. And that's the bit that, as a sociologist, has captured my attention.
All right.
I think should drive us further.
I'm going to go real geeky on you here.
Please.
So in Star Trek, they have this thing called the prime objective, which is, or the prime imperative maybe it is, you're not allowed to violate the norms of another planet. You can't go in and introduce a new piece of technology that changes the historical trajectory of a planet. Now, if we use that as a metaphor, you go in and you say, oh, you're a perpetrator, you're a slave, when in fact neither of those two parties may have understood that they were a perpetrator or a slave. So are you naming something that wasn't named before in that context?
Methodologically, the answer is no, for several reasons. Because if I had come in and said, I couldn't help but notice that you're a thing that I have a label for, right? This is a way for conversations to fall apart very quickly. Right. In our own lives, we can imagine this if we talk to people who we're friends with and say, I couldn't help but notice that you're a lonely and bitter person, right? Then there's nowhere else the conversation can go from there.
Yeah.
So there's a puzzle here about how we enter space in a way that is humble and appreciative of individuals' own experiences of their own lives.
Yeah.
And this circles back around, I think, in some ways to your earlier question, because I didn't come in and say I couldn't help but notice that you're oppressing others. Mm-hmm. I came in and I asked, what's going on around here? What's new around here? Mm-hmm. And I asked a sort of open-ended question that actually paved the way for conversations about rain. Turns out there's not a lot of rain. About the government. Turns out they're not doing what people think they should be doing. About local law enforcement. They're not as pliable and amenable to bribes as they had been in the past. It led these conversations about all sorts of things, including relationships with laborers. And in some cases, those laborers were daily laborers who they had these landlords, let's call them here, had problems with. In other cases, they were bonded laborers who had become uppity in the face of troublesome policies and troublesome new groups in the community. Now, on the side, I knew that these troublesome new groups were human rights advocacy groups who had named this a particular thing, bonded labor, a form of contemporary slavery, but that wasn't the language that I used with perpetrators, just like the language of perpetrators isn't what I used with perpetrators, which gets at something really interesting about how we even think of ourselves. And that's, again, in the big picture, why I thought this community was interesting to speak with, not just for a contemporary abolitionist framework and agenda, but also in thinking about how all of us end up confronting things that we do that we're not proud of, things we discover that they violate, as I said earlier, violate human rights, violate new ideas about what's right, but maybe haven't violated norms in our communities. This is certainly true in my own intergenerational past. I'm sure I'm doing things right now. My kids will come back around and say, "How could you ever have? I drive a combustible engine car. I'm going to get grief for that in 15 years. I promise you."
Yeah, we all will, I think. But so let me just think a little bit more about you as the subject position that you occupy as a researcher. I have a friend who's an anthropologist that works on did a book on public lynchings in Bolivia, and one of the biggest challenges for him to be accepted by the local community. So he arrives from, could be planet Mars, and with all of his ideas and all his training in anthropology, but the first thing he had to do was build a certain amount of rapport and trust with the local community. And oftentimes when quote unquote foreigners come into a community to do that research, there's deep suspicion in the local community. Who is this person? They work for the government, they're going to collect taxes, they're trying to count the number of people in my family, whatever it is that they're doing. So you had to develop rapport, like you say. You couldn't name things as you named them. You couldn't just walk up to people and said, when was the last time you enslaved somebody, right? There's a real seriousness to the ethnographic inquiry, but also the rapport and trust that's required for you as a researcher to gain access to these practices and then to do the sort of interpretive analysis that's required to understand what some of these practices were, let alone the culture and the culture of acceptability that was wrapped around those relationships.
The broad generic answer is that I use something called a leapfrog method, unlike snowball sampling, where you sort of move along through a community and picking up whatever you can. I grew up in the world with snow. We can roll snowballs. They pick up leaves. They pick up all sorts of sticks, all sorts of things you might not want in your data. So I didn't do a snowball sample, which would have gotten me lots of data, but maybe then I have to go parse through. I did something called a leapfrog approach, in which I had conversations that didn't go so well, and I said, thank you I didn't get what I was looking for. I said, thank you very much. Person obviously wasn't a perpetrator. I said, appreciate your time, and I moved on.
How did you know they weren't a perpetrator?
All right, so okay, look, so let me say let me say what I did, and then I'm going to answer that question.
Good.
And then in conversations where I felt that a person was a perpetrator, I said, well, who else in your community has experienced, or who else that I could speak with has experienced something like this? And then they would refer me on over the heads of others who didn't have that same experience. And over the course of the conversation, it became clear to them and to me the area that we were talking about where there's the most energy in the conversation was around workers and the relationship with workers, sometimes daily laborers, sometimes bonded laborers. And how I actually determined that was the case was a lot of, it involves trying to not catch them in a lie in a way that's obvious, but to do a lot of triangulation on the fly to determine which bits add up and which bits don't add up.
Because there's real honor about that. Catching someone out in a lie could be quite undermine their sense of honor within the community.
Could undermine their sense of honor, and then also you're also trying in that moment to decide whether or not a person is being forthright or not about something that they're willing to be forthright about under the right conditions. And so there's a tremendous amount of, I used the term earlier, but like judgment. It's this on-the-fly judgment where I'm trying to decide, is this person telling the truth? And if they're not telling the truth, are they telling the truth? Are they not telling the truth in a way that additional conversation could sort of tease this out? And so I did two other things that I had not started out doing, but I developed as time went on. The first was I grew my beard out, and it became very apparent to me that beards were a signal of additional spiritual status in many of the communities that I was in. And so I I used that to my advantage, and so I grew my beard longer than it had been in earlier research trips. The second thing is that I accentuated the difference between, as it increasingly in conversations became clear that perpetrators had intergenerational concerns. My father's life was one way, my life is this way, my children, who knows?
Okay.
So concerns about the future. So I started telling stories anecdotally and on the fly about the fact that my grandfather was a farmer in Pennsylvania. My father who went to school through 8th grade. My father has a university education, and I was studying for my PhD.
Yeah.
I said, look at how the world changes.
Yeah.
From my grandfather's time. So that kind of establishing my credibility as somebody who came from a farming background made a difference when I was interviewing farmers, for example.
So this
other techniques like this, I can go on, but
that's great.
It's
It's a rapport, but also an empathy approach, because you're trying to identify with them as much as you can, despite quite different worlds that you come from. So how many perpetrators did you speak to in the end?
So in the end, I spoke with 40 perpetrators, and of those 40, there's a subset of 20 in which I also interviewed their victims,
right?
Their victims or survivors, depending on where they were in this larger process of emancipation.
That's amazing. And so what did you learn about the perpetrators? What are the sort of key insights that you gained through this study?
So the things that I came away with I hope come through most clearly in the book is the sense to which, and again, emphasizing that I wasn't in jail speaking with people who had been arrested for let's say, trafficking for sexual exploitation, where perpetrators, their entire half their job is staying out of jail and staying away from the law and this sort of thing. So I was speaking to people who had broken laws, but in their own minds, lots of additional cultural and personal stakes were. I don't know, things were at play. So what came across in interview after interview was a sense of loss, a sense of lost relationship, a lost community with workers who they felt in an earlier era had been members of their family and who they had actually treated with dignity and honor as is appropriate for them as a landed gentry, and they were no longer being repaid with a sort of respect or responded to with a sort of respect they felt that they had not deserved because of their status, but earned out of relationship. And that sense of deep relational embeddedness is what struck me the most. Now, some of that may have been a facade. It may have been a show from me to say, well, we're with these really great folks, of course. But but the fact that was the language that they selected, as opposed to the language of justice. Right? These people owe us money, and now they're not paying the money. I heard plenty of that, but in case after case after case, it was this language of relational loss that they chose to present in our conversations, and that was the most striking and the thing I was the least prepared for.
Right. And at one part in the book, you talk about someone saying, "Oh, that's my master over there." I don't know if that was the correct word, but there was a public acknowledgement of the person across the village square who controls me, but that was almost accepted unproblematically as part of the norm. Could you talk about and unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, there were these cases in which in which survivors would respond to my questions about, well, who did this to you? And I would say, well, it was,
that guy over there. Yeah.
There are other cases in which I actually asked groups of survivors in the round, who like women's collectives in some cases had these incredible stories of abuse and then collective action, struggle against perpetrators, and then ultimate victory. They formed these self-help groups. And I'd ask, well, who did this? And it would be somebody at the edge of that circle, a sort of a shame-faced person who came for, I was the one who did these things. And that was striking to me is the extent to which both the exploitation and whatever followed took place in community. And again, this is very different from cases of trafficking for labor or sexual exploitation, where oftentimes an individual definitionally is extracted from their native place. This is a situation where people prior to, during, and after exploitation have lived together and have to find ways of relating and then relating anew after an intervention.
So this sounds a lot like the Gacaca process in Rwanda, right? So post-genocide or politicide, whichever term you want to use for that tragic set of events, there have been a series of community-based justice initiatives called Gacaca courts, which are, communities deciding for themselves what to do with perpetrators and how survivors ought to relate to them. This sounds very similar to that, but in the Indian context.
Yeah, I think there's some incredible lessons for the movement that we're part of to learn from these other efforts at reconciliation, at finding ways to acknowledge that there's no way to, that this is an important lesson from Rwanda, is you can't arrest and imprison that many people over the sorts of periods of time necessary for the entire community to feel that justice has been done in a criminal justice framework. So what does restorative justice look like? That's an incredible puzzle we can ask of India, where we see millions and tens of millions of people actually held in these same conditions, and it's impossible to arrest our way out of that problem, especially if we're dealing with people who will sit shamefacedly at the edge of a group and say, well, shucks, that was me, and feel something close to remorse for it. I mean, that's, this is, a lot of the book is about what people said rather than what people actually.
Yeah. So do they desist from the practice, or do they move to another village? Or
yeah. So what I found in this was that if perpetrators had the means to persist, they had a choice, and they had a choice to either give up and quit altogether, pivot into a new form of economic activity, sometimes less abusive, but abusive nonetheless. And in other cases, they were able to persist without repercussions because they either had the status necessary to continue unperturbed by authorities, or they had the cash to pay people off.
Yeah. And
so this is a little bit on the geekier side of where the book goes, but in these times of transition and change that these perpetrators found themselves in, I found in case after case that they were in some cases able to launder their status.
Right.
And so if they'd had caste status before, and now they only have caste status, that's no longer enough in many cases to say, get back to the field. Why? Because I told you to. Why? Because I have a cosmic position that you don't have.
Right. That
became difficult to sustain. But if an individual was told, get back to the field, they asked why, and the answer was because the police are in my pocket, that's a credible threat. But it used to be the police could be in your pocket just because you were a landlord. Now the police might be in your pocket because you actually have cash. And in several of these cases, perpetrators who had huge positional power didn't actually have a lot of capital, and in some cases were indebted to banks themselves. In some cases, they'd gotten their funding from the Grameen Bank, for example, and that was the seed money that led to the rolling capital they had to actually secure bonded laborers in the first place. So access to capital and cash matters post-emancipation for survivors, but it also matters for perpetrators who, if they had access to capital and cash, could make a decision. Do I want to go into a legitimate form of business, or do I want to really stick it out here under?
So if they didn't have a lot of capital and cash, what motivated them? Was it power, or was it something else that motivated them? And how did they then rationalize what they were doing?
Well, I think in a lot of these cases, it was a hereditary form of livelihood that they'd undertaken from an earlier generation, and they were asking themselves this very question on the fly, which is, why should we continue with this? If it actually costs more politically than we gain economically, then is this who we really are? And that, really, where I wish we could go further is to actually answer that question about inner transformation, because we have this idea about a post-traumatic sort of slavery disorder, ideas about chains around the brain in terms of what it takes for people to come out of sort of radically abusive physical emotional context and into something closer to freedom. I have the same question for perpetrators, because the amount of, or the number and range of additional opportunities for a small-time perpetrator is much larger than it is for their victims, but not a lot larger.
Not a lot larger.
And that's fascinating for me in terms of how we think freedom will actually roll out for communities on the ground. And this is back to your question, why did I write the book?
Right.
In part because I think they've got to be part of that process.
Yeah.
And I think you're invoking of Rwanda as an excellent observation that sometimes it takes both of these communities, not under all conditions and all forms of exploitation, but it takes both of these communities to work towards something that looks like broadly distributed justice.
Well, it's half of the story that's never told, and it shares certain features with the work of Bill Simmons in an earlier podcast that we did, and he has a book coming out called Joyful Human Rights, and he said, all these human rights are full of woe and all these sort of horrible things that have happened to people, but people who are victims of human rights violations have another part of their life. They're mothers and fathers, they're parents, they're friends, they're people that have jobs and careers and all sorts of other things. And similarly with survivors of slavery, they have exactly all those things, and yet we don't hear about that. We hear about all the awful things that happen to them. And equally, if you look at a perpetrator, there's another half to their life. And in Bill's book, he said the hardest chapter to write in that book was joyful perpetrators. How do you talk about the normal, quote unquote, normal life of a perpetrator when in fact they're carrying out various acts, etc., in their power relationship over a victim? And it's quite difficult to think about the flip side, the other half that's never told. And I think you achieve that in the book nicely. I guess my last question for you is, how well do you think the lessons from the Indian case travel to other cases? Because I'm at heart a comparativist, as you know, and the Rwanda thing popped into my mind as we were talking, but I'm thinking about some of the work we're doing here with some interventions in other countries. India is one of the cases. There may be other cases, some in Africa, some in Latin America. How well do some of the things that you learn actually travel to different contexts?
In a lot of ways, I think that the case of India or of the sort of belt from Pakistan and India into Nepal of exploitation that relies on cultural practices is sui generis, and it really relies on a particularly complicated set of relationships and contexts. So at one level, I'd say there's tens of millions of people living in exploitation in these contexts. Something like 18 million living in cases of contemporary of contemporary slavery. So that's one answer, right? But more broadly, and the reason that I like to think of these and characterize these perpetrators as people who had violated human rights but not local norms is because I think there's a broader lesson if we step outside of the slavery, trafficking and slavery framework, and we think more broadly about human rights violations or about things that are I don't know what we call pre-human rights things that aren't quite human rights violations yet, but they're on the horizon. I mentioned combustible engines. These are things that in every generation there are new norms and new forces and actors mobilize around social change issues. And so the question for me is, how does it feel to be in that moment when you realize the thing you're doing is no longer acceptable?
Right.
And so in a lot of ways, this doesn't travel to, as I mentioned earlier, let's say traffickers whose job it is to know how to break somebody, who know how to evade the police, and who know how to disappear into the night. I mean, that's important and distinct sort of human rights violator. What I'm more attracted to is human rights violators who spend most of their time passing externally, but also to their own selves in terms of what kind of person they are. And so even this stratagem, let's call it a stratagem, of describing their relationship with their victims as one of a relationship shot through with paternalism, even that act, that decision to gesture like that, I think really tells us something important, not just about traffickers writ large, but about this community in particular. But then the comparative case for me is me, right? I'm the comparative case. What are the things I'm overlooking in my own life that I dismiss because, well, that's the way the market works, or but I only spend so much money on clothes, or I only have so much time in my day because I have kids and a career and all these other things. So we all find ways of excusing away things that we know we should do better at. And I'd much rather press into that puzzle and conundrum than I would answer the easy question, which is, why am I not a trafficker?
The other tension, I guess, that intersects with that is this whole tension that we started out with between the universality and the particularity of things. So you referenced, there's human rights and then there's this other stuff. We haven't yet called it a human rights violation, but we think we might be able to. And that transcendence, if you will, of what we claim to be universal human rights principles and how they don't land locally. And equally, how well do those concepts travel? I think it was Renton that called them homeomorphic equivalents. They don't call them human rights, but they feel and think about them in very similar ways to what we might call them as human rights. So I think it's a really important study. I think the work that you've done was brave, quite difficult. I think establishing the rapport, going into the community, understanding all these complex relationships, looking at the way in which they were culturally and contextually understood, and those self-deceptive practices. I guess the final concept you probably uncovered was this notion of false consciousness that Gramsci talks about, right? That these people didn't know that they were being exploited, perhaps, or at least the way you asked the questions, there was a revelation about their exploitation, but it was never named explicitly so. So great lessons, I think, actually, that travel out of the context, that are probing for us to think about as the work in this area continues. So for that, I thank you for coming in today and sharing all your thoughts and views on the Rights Track. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Christine Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 3 of the podcast is funded by the Rights Lab, a University of Nottingham programme of research looking to end modern slavery. You can find out more in our episode show notes at www.rightstrack.org and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms, including iTunes and Spotify.